Without further ado, I'd like to say we have three speakers who have all made wonderful contributions to Schoenberg scholarship. Jack Boss with his analyses, remarkable analyses of 12-tone music. Fusako Hamao, who educated us to the influence of Schoenberg in Japan. No one else had done that. And then we have Phil Stoecker, who, of course, has also contributed in 12-tone music, and then also the American circle of 12-tone, the 12-tone school in New York, and basically on the composer George Pearl. And yes, wonderful contributions there. So we'll start. I will read their bios, and our first speaker will be Jack Boss. Jack Boss is professor of music theory and composition at the University of Oregon. His research interests center on motive harmony and long-range coherence in modern music. Professor Boss has published many articles and book chapters on Schoenberg's music, among other topics, including Music Theory Online article on George Walker's piano music. He has presented his research throughout the United States, as well as in England, Scotland, Ireland, Canada, South Korea, and Brazil. His first book, Schoenberg's 12-Tone Music, Symmetry and the Musical Idea, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. In 2015, it was given the Wallace Berry Award by the Society for Music Theory. A companion volume, Schoenberg's Atonal Music, Musical Idea, Basic Image, and Specters of Tonal Function, was published by Cambridge in 2019. The third and last book in this trilogy, Schoenberg's Tonal Music, Depictive Text Setting and the Birth of the Musical Idea, is under contract with Cambridge University Press and should be completed by the end of 2024. Today's paper comes out of Chapter 4 from this forthcoming book. Let's welcome Jack.
So first of all, thank you to the Hofstra Cultural Center for sponsoring us, to Phil, many thanks for organizing us, and especially to our long-suffering technical coordinator who has had to set up 3 different systems, and it's been difficult, but I think we're going to make it through. So I'll try to not mess us up here. So the literature about Schoenberg's symphonic poem, Pelleas und Melisande, has concerned itself primarily with negotiating a conflict between 2 stylistic directions. Scholars have debated for years whether the work ought to be understood as a blow-by-blow leitmotivic account of Maurice Maeterlinck's play, or, on the other hand, as a 2-dimensional sonata form. And for those who don't know the term, 2-dimensional sonata forms are works that project a single sonata form at the deepest level and the 4 movements of a sonata cycle on a level closer to the surface, according to Stephen van de Mortela. Alban Berg was the first to suggest the 2-dimensional sonata view in 1920, though his analysis also accounts for many of the ways the leitmotifs depict the story. Van de Mortela presents a similar case, understanding Pelleas as a bridge between works of Liszt and Strauss and Schoenberg's later works that illustrate 2-dimensional sonata. Michael Cherlin and Ethan Hamao, on the other hand, are strong proponents for reading Pelleas und Melisande as driven by its program, and both suggest that attempts to understand it as absolute music have interfered with critics' ability to grasp the true value, its true value as a work of art. Finally, Karl Dahlhaus and Walter Frisch characterize Pelleas und Melisande as a balance between programmatic depiction and absolute musical design, with different opinions about how well it does that. Dahlhaus characterizes it as effectively balancing depiction and narrative with absolute musical form, while Frisch writes, and I quote, "It is probably the least successful of the large-scale instrumental works of Schoenberg's early period. We sense Schoenberg struggling to reconcile programmatic and thematic formal demands. Close quote. My contribution to the discussion about Pelleas, as I have done for many of Schoenberg's 8-tonal and 12-tone pieces, is to suggest that a large-scale narrative based on the motivic and tonal depiction of Maeterlinck's play does indeed span the piece. This narrative involves a problem that is presented, elaborated through several stages, leading to further problems, and eventually resolved. In other words, the story of Pelleas and Melisande gave Schoenberg an opportunity to present what he called a musical idea. This idea motivates both Schoenberg's depiction of the work's program and his divergences from the usual patterns of sonata form, and helps to explain the unusual features of both the narrative and the form. My purpose in today's presentation, then, will be to outline what exactly was the large problem, elaboration, solution narrative that Maeterlinck's drama afforded Schoenberg, and make a few remarks about how he realized that through leitmotifs and the work's overall key structure. Let's begin with an overview of the key scheme of the whole work and how it reflects the overarching narrative of Maeterlinck's play. A very sketchy synopsis of the story follows. This is the tragic story of two half-brothers, Gallo and Pelleas, and their mutual love interest, Melisande. Gallo discovers Melisande in the woods, lost, and convinces her to come home with him and be his wife. But soon after, Melisande meets Pelleas and gradually falls in love with him. Their love grows through scenes in a park where Melisande plays with and loses her wedding ring. That was my title slide. And a castle tower where she lets her hair down to Pelleas. Gallo considers getting revenge on Pelleas by taking him to vaults below the castle and throwing him into a chasm. But he relents, and Pelleas and Melisande's love continues to develop, reaching its climax in the same park at night. Gallo discovers them there, and in his jealousy kills Pelleas and wounds Melisande. She returns home, but falls into a coma and dies not long after, leaving Gallo alone to mourn her and Pelleas and torture himself with remorse over killing them. Example 1 shows the key scheme in quasi-Schenkerian graph form. The first movement of the four-movement cycle that I mentioned closest to the surface is a sonata movement from measures 1 to 160. During its introduction, there are hints of D minor. At the place corresponding to Gallo's initial encounter of Melisande, measures 27 to 31, chord progressions begin to point in the direction of D major, the key that represents Gallo's ideal of a happy marriage, while D minor represents his reality of being alone and filled with remorse at the end. Both keys are summarized by the D4 consonant skip at the beginning of my graph. Just checking. Gallo never manages to turn the key toward D major in the introduction, though he tries, and this constitutes the work's initial problem. Instead, he settles for the major key on the third scale degree, F, in the passage representing his marriage to Melisande at measure 44. This passage features Gallo's theme, the P theme in the cycle sonata movement. As this theme continues, it modulates up another third to A major. Even though Gallo is not able to reach his ideal of D major, two modulations in the upward direction seem to signify the relationship between him and Melisande growing more joyful. Perhaps things will work out. However, Pelleas leaps onto the scene in measure 89 with Pelleas' theme, the S theme in E major, represented by the first-second scale degree in example 1. This key, which others have struggled to explain in sonata terms, can be understood more simply as a move in the downward direction after the upward arpeggio through D, F, and A. It is an important further elaboration of the work's problem because it forces Gallo's upward movement toward joy and marital bliss in the opposite direction with a descent that will ultimately lead to D minor, loneliness, and remorse. The music then, after measure 137, retraces the three previous locations on the graph, F, A, and E. There is a return to a fragment of Gallo's theme at measure 137 that recalls F major, corresponding to the recapitulation of Gounod's P theme in the opening sonata movement. The key of A major comes back at measure 161 to begin the scherzo, the second movement of the four-movement cycle, which portrays Melisande and Pelleas playing with Gounod's wedding ring and dropping it into a fountain. The episode at the castle tower, where Melisande lets down her hair to Pelleas, also part of the second movement, begins securely in E major, and near the same scene's end, there is a clear half cadence in E. By this point, we have recognized E major as the location in which Pelleas and Melisande's new love is growing. Then, the music of the following episode, the one in the castle vaults, where Gounod contemplates throwing Pelleas into the abyss, is set in D minor. There it is. Set in D minor, which serves as a presentiment of where the story will eventually end. This D is represented as a lower neighbor in example 1, however, because Pelleas and Melisande are able to recapture E major as the setting for their final love scene, which is the third adagio movement of the four-movement cycle. This movement builds to increasingly climactic half cadences in E, but never continues to tonic, a metaphor for Pelleas and Melisande's love being unfulfilled and eventually interrupted by the murderous intrusion of Gounod. After Gounod kills Pelleas, Schoenberg portrays Melisande's death, followed by Gounod reviewing the story and finally being trapped in his thoughts of remorse, with a finale movement that also serves as the recapitulation for the larger sonata movement spanning the work. At measure 461, we hear a stretch of music in C-sharp minor that Michael Cherlin associates with Melisande's nightmares during the coma she falls into just before dying. Later, at measure 541, the music portraying her death begins over an E-flat, B-flat pedal that will sustain for most of the scene. Thus, the approach to the final D minor in Pelleas and Melisande creates a double neighbor surrounding the eventual tonic. At measure 566 in Pelleas, the music lands in D minor, and after a short diversion, it is locked into D minor for the final time at measure 631 with the penultimate appearance of the fate motive, a motive that had appeared several times earlier in the piece to represent the inevitable tragic end to the story. The music after measure 631 then proceeds to review the motive D, F, E, E-flat, D in the bass, a summary of the whole key structure. I understand this to signify Gounod, realizing he has lost both Pelleas and Melisande, reviewing his action in his mind. Now, I'd like to take a look at 3 places in this overall story in more detail. The first passage, measures 24 to 31, is shown in example 2. This music represents that point at which Gounod enters the play to find Melisande lost and crying. Motive and harmony work together to depict not just Gounod's stealthy ingress into this scene, but also his objective to capture Melisande and create a successful marriage relationship with her in D major, while Melisande resists. The whole passage overlaps motives representing Melisande that enter on second and fourth beats of the measure as the labels in the top 2 staves of the score show. So give me just a second to run through these. And then there's some on the next slide as well. In the midst of the dense contrapuntal structure created by these, as well as other voices, the first, second, and third horns enter on the fourth beat of measure 27 to play Gounod's motive. The horns are marked soft but definite, bring out, to represent Gounod's stealth, but also his determination like a hunter stalking his prey. However, It is the tonal context of the Melisande and Galop motives that best represents Galop's objective and Melisande's attempts to avoid it. The overlapping entries of Melisande start on pitch classes that cycle through the ascending D whole tone scale twice, starting with D5 on the second beat of measure 24 and ending on D6 on the fourth and eighth note of measure 30. And these various entry pitch classes are circled on the score in example 2, and I'll run through those for you. And then also on the next slide. Though D is the starting and ending point, the use of the even whole tone scale makes it difficult for the ear to gravitate toward D as a center, and the underlying harmonies support the sense of tonal drifting. The Galop motive's entrance in measure 27 creates a significant contrast with the sound world created by the overlapping Melisande motives. As the Schenkerian graph below shows, by itself, Galop's motive creates a 3-2-1 Urlinier transference in D major. Not only that, but the notes in between create a chain of descending fifths with F sharp, E, and D, F sharp, B, E, A, D. This gives the listener a distinct sense of the horns attempting to impose tonal order in D major, though the surrounding chords certainly do not support that impulse. Instead, they continue to rise by whole step. They're G flat augmented, G sharp half diminished 7, A flat augmented, A sharp half diminished 7, B flat augmented 4-2, B sharp half diminished 7, and C augmented. I propose that we read the conflict between parts of the texture that push down through descending fifths to D major and other parts that rise through whole tone scales as a portrayal of Galop trying to impose a happy marital relationship on Melisande and Melisande pushing back against him. This creates the work's initial conflict, the central problem of its musical idea. And I'd like to listen to this. This recording will go back to the previous slide, which I can't do here, but you've got your handouts. Is it coming through the speaker? Okay. There's the horns. The second passage we'll explore in detail is measures 449 to 60A, shown in example 3. This is the portrayal of Galop striking Pelleas dead and wounding Melisande. It does this by presenting the bass motion F, E, E flat D, the crux of Pelleas and Melisande. This bass progression reviews many of the events of the tone poem which led to this point: Galop's winning over Melisande in F major, and Pelleas' intrusion into the story in E major, as well as the castle tower scene and the love scene, all in E major or striving toward it. It also predicts the remainder of the story, Melisande's death in E flat minor, and Galop's remorse in D minor at the end. As example 3 shows, the note F begins as a pedal point supporting the fate motive. Remember that fate is a motive that signifies the ultimate outcome of the story, Pelleas and Melisande dead and Galop filled with remorse. The F then continues together with its chord note A in dotted rhythms under the 5 blows Galop uses to strike Pelleas dead. All but one of these blows are represented by B flat half diminished 7th chords in the brasses, dissonant with the pedal F in low brasses. Then E sustains in low brass and strings under a dissonant fragmented version of Pelleas' theme, the S theme at measure 89 that had represented his entry into the drama. Wait a minute. Okay. There's the E. There's the fragmented version of Pelleas' theme. Here's the original version. The fragmentation of Pelleas' theme represents his final moments. Schoenberg transforms the theme to replace its perfect fifths and fourths with tritones, portraying Pelleas' dire situation, and then breaks off the last tritone B2 to F2, repeating that descent with wider intervals, A2, C sharp 2, and F2, G sharp 1, to portray his last breaths. The final note, G sharp, finds a consonant interval with the pedal E, enabling us to hear it as a resolution to the third scale degree in E major after all the dissonance, a sketch of Pelleas finding peace at the moment of death. The next two steps in the bass progression happen quickly. The second bassoon moves from E2 through E flat 2 to D2, and the first bassoon plays G sharp 2, G2, F sharp 2, a major third above it, giving the impression that, having gotten Pelleas out of the way, Gallot is attempting to move quickly to D major and that fulfilled marriage with Melisande that he has been seeking since the beginning of the piece. He's attempting to finally resolve the work's original problem to his advantage. But there are two further problems created by this move. First, the second bassoon passes through E flat on its way down, which will later prolong itself into a key area, E flat minor, to set Melisande's death. By forcing Pelleas' death in E to get down to D, Gallot has brought on the unintended consequence of the passing tone E flat, which will prove to be disastrous. Second, though Melisande, represented by her signature motive, is willing to stay above the D F sharp pedal for two measures, at the last moment of the section, she escapes Gallot's clutches musically by changing the D major triad to a half diminished seventh chord. And I'd like to listen to this. Dare I try to switch the sound here, or am I going to throw everything else off if I do that? Okay. Yeah, that's why. Okay. Second slide. After Melisande's coma scene in C sharp minor, the lower neighbor, and her death scene in E flat minor, the upper neighbor, Gallot is left alone to consider the consequences of his actions, and though he manages to avoid the key of D minor for several measures, he finally is locked into that key, like a prison in his own mind, in measures 631 to 639. This passage, there it is seen in example 4, the work's final Urlinier descent. It signifies the ultimate resolution of the problem of not being able to reach D major or a happy marriage with Melisande, but of course, the resolution is one of complete failure, an unhappy ending. The passage begins with the fate motive repeating 3 times, growing softer and slower as it does, and the accompanying voice is reduced to long notes and tremolos, all of this depicting Gallot's suffering in silence. Fate prolongs 3, the third scale degree, and D minor through lower neighbors G sharp to A and C sharp to D, as it has in previous instances, but now this particular third scale degree leads to the work's final Urlinier descent. Before it hadn't. Just before that descent begins in measure 635, though, we hear the basses, cellos, bassoons, and trombones descend F, E flat, D. A reminder of the music of measures 449 to 60 that represented Galop killing Pelleas, and through that beginning the process that would bring on Melisande's death. The Urlinier descent for the work then occurs in measures 635 to 37A, and its pitch classes, F, E, D, are projected by the beginning of the Galop theme in the oboes, English horn, clarinets, and bass clarinet. The final arrival of the work in D minor is thus associated with Galop and his ultimate mental state. Even more strongly reinforcing the association is the bass line in tremolo, cellos, and basses, third bassoon and contrabassoon in measures 635 to 37A, a walking bass that seems to me to portray Galop being marched down to prison. The final three notes of this bass line, E, E flat, D, remind us and Galop again of his murder of Pelleas and eventually Melisande. Then, measures 637 to 39A represent both the Urlinier descent and the walking bass in the brass section, with alterations to emphasize the E flat minor triad. Melisande's death. The Urlinier transference in first trumpet is changed to 3 flat 2-1. 3 flat 2-1 with a minor Neapolitan sixth under the flat 2, and the bass line adds A flat, G flat, and F natural, and then ends with the full progression from measures 449 to 60, F, E, E flat, D. A better portrayal of Galop trapped in the solitary confinement of his own mind, replaying over and over again the events that led to Pelleas and Melisande's deaths, could not be imagined. Let's listen. Previous slide. And now this slide. Thus ends this long, tonally, and motivically rich piece. As Dahlhaus recognized, it strikes a balance between faithful portrayal of much of the action and psychology of the play and a two-dimensional sonata form. But both story and form in Pelleas serve a higher purpose, that is, to manifest a large narrative of problem, elaborations, and final solution, a musical idea. The initial problem of Galop being unable to make Melisande a fully willing captive and reach an authentic cadence in D major branches out into multiple elaborations. These include Galop's settling for F major and A major instead, Pelleas' entry and the growth of Pelleas and Melisande's love in E major, turning down in the opposite direction from Galop's upward motion, and ultimately Galop's attempt to force the music further down to D major by killing Pelleas, but inadvertently hitting on E flat on the way, resulting in Melisande's death. The work's final solution, its arrival in D minor, had been predicted from the beginning by several catastrophic interruptions of the fate motive, that's Michael Charlin's term, which turn out to be premonitions of Galop's final state, trapped alone in his guilt and remorse. This represents the inexorable outcome of all this work's elaborations, tying them together in an unhappy ending. Thank you.
Any questions for Jack?
I guess there's two questions I want to ask, and they're a little bit broad. One is, how Wagnerian is this? How, Mullerian? Is there any kind of, you mentioned, the different motives associated with the characters. Mm-hmm. If I ask you, how is the shape of the kinds of things that, and the pitches that you mentioned differing from Wagner, or do you consider this a kind of plan of Schoenberg to find his own Wagnerian interpretation, or to work his voice leading so it doesn't sound purely Wagnerian?
Okay, good. So yeah, the answer to that question would sort of be yes and no. It's Wagnerian in the sense that it's so dependent on leitmotifs, and not just Wagner, but Richard Strauss, was also a huge impact. Many of you know this story, that this piece was sort of written as a kind of a audition for Strauss, at least. He wanted Strauss to conduct it for him. And so I think he was, kind of doing things that he had heard in Strauss's music to impress, the master. From the standpoint of key schemes, I think you can find, things in Mahler, or not Mahler, but Wagner and Strauss, that also sort of look forward to this. I think of the opening of Tristan and Isolde and its inability to reach an authentic cadence, kind of moving to 5 and then moving to 5 again and then moving to 5 again. And you see that in the love scene, except in E major, I think, and, Wagner's is an A major, if I remember correctly. So, but it's the same idea, representing sort of unrequited love, unfulfilled love by building up to these huge cadences, huge swells up to a cadence, and then not quite getting there at the end. So, but the one thing that kind of goes beyond all of these composers, and maybe I need to do more of a study of Wagner this way, is that I don't sense the large-scale narrative there. Or if there is a large-scale narrative, it's just following the story. It's expressing the story. And Schoenberg, has his, conflict and resolution, which is kind of the main point of this book, actually, is to try to show that it was in existence even at this point in his career. And he was finding texts, that enabled him to do that more effectively. And Wagner, at least in my experience, not to the same extent, nor Richard Strauss to the same extent. So Schoenberg's music is kind of moving beyond in that sense.
Anyone else? Yeah. Ben? Well, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Great analysis, really, a compelling overview, of the conflict, the resolution. One thing you mentioned about the bassoon's role in adding adding a twist to one of the later musical events.
So traveling through E flat.
Yeah. Made me think, the orchestration in this piece is so great. Mm. And are there either leitmotivic or structural connections that are made by instruments playing a role or being associated with one character or event?
Yeah.
Have you gotten into any of that with your larger analysis?
I have. It's not a matter of emphasis, and this is something that the literature does talk about a little bit too, but I think it's the Pelleas themes, that a lot of writers tend to emphasize. Walter Frisch talks about it being a trumpet theme and then, a horn counter theme, and those are both sort of noble, happy, exciting, kinds of sounds. In contrast to bassoon and low trombones and that sort of thing, and a downward motion, on top of that, representing sort of the one of the nadirs of this particular story. So I think definitely he chose his instruments carefully, and they do support the leitmotivic connections. And maybe also, just some of the transformations that the different motives go through. I mean, that was a point that I didn't emphasize much, and others have talked about it, but that's happening in this piece. And I guess that's another way in which it's Wagnerian, that the leitmotifs change as the character's situation changes. And one of the ways that they change is they're represented by different instruments. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jack. I really enjoyed this a lot. My question is a methodological question. So, in dealing with narrative, one of the sticky points is often the issue of agency. Yes. And, Monahan and Hatton and Almain, they all kind of have, theorizing this out is always a kind of tricky thing in their writing. And I was just wondering what your influences were there in terms of your methodological approach.
Yeah. So with respect to the music as agent, the composer as agent, or?
Well, you talked about Golo as an agent and Melisande,
the character as agent.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering if if that's in fact what do you really mean that, or how you kind of what was the kind of methodological basis of how you made that kind of decision? Yeah,
really kind of based more on the traditions that he's coming out of. So, the composers, and this is, sort of related to my answer to Sev's question. The Wagner and Strauss, they have, lots of examples of sort of motives changing and, being affected by what's happening in the life of the character. So he's following a pattern, that the composers before him followed. And so I, was inclined to sort of interpret it in that same sense.
Well, I thought it was a really compelling analysis. So thank you so much for sharing it with us.
I appreciate that. Good.
I could ask another question, but I think we have to move on, and I'll ask you about silence in the piece. Yeah, afterward. And shall we please thank you. Our next speaker is Fusako Hamao, and as I mentioned before, she has brought knowledge of Schoenberg in Japan. Read her article in the Journal of the Arnold Schoenberg Institute, because frankly, I don't know of any other literature that covers this. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I could be, but I haven't. And today she will speak, as you can see, about Pierrot lunaire in post-war Japan, the dramaturgical impulse behind the music. Let's welcome her. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I forgot to read her bio. I got so excited about the topic. Okay, let me read her biography. Fusako Hamao is an independent scholar who received her PhD in music theory from Yale University. Her research interests include the music of Arnold Schoenberg, his Japanese connection, and the reception of Western music in Japan. She's presented papers at meetings of the Arnold Schoenberg Symposium, the Society for Music Theory, the American Musicological Society, and other regional and international conferences. Her articles and review appeared in the Journal of the Arnold Schoenberg Center, Gamut, Online Journal of Music Theory Society of the Mid-Atlantic, 19th Century Music, Journal of the Royal Music Association, and Current Musicology. Her article on Schoenberg's metronome markings appeared in the current issue of the European Journal of Musicology. Let's welcome her.
select start slideshow. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. In 1954, a group of young artists and composers who started an avant-garde art movement known as Jikken Kobo experimental workshop organized a chamber music concert featuring Schoenberg's works, which included the Japanese premiere of Pierrot lunaire. The vocal part was played by Akuribi Fukuzawa, a European-trained soprano singer. The conductor was Yoshiro Irino, a Japanese composer who had learned Schoenberg's 12-tone method from literature. 6 weeks before the concert, a performance of Pierrot lunaire by the same musicians was broadcast on radio across Japan. Next year, playwright and director Tetsuji Takechi collaborated with members of Jikken Kobo and produced Schoenberg's Pierrot lunaire as an avant-garde play. It was staged in a circular theater modeled after Greek amphitheater in Tokyo. Takechi adapted the 21 melodramas of Pierrot lunaire into a stage production with a coherent storyline. The lyrics were translated into Japanese and sung by the soprano singer who played the role of Columbine. Takechi modified the plot to include Harley Quinn, a stock character of the Commedia dell'arte. Pierrot and Harley Quinn were silent roles choreographed in the style of nogaku, a traditional Japanese theatrical form that is abstract and minimalistic. This production is considered an epoch-making theatrical experiment in post-war Japan, but it was not until 2009 that art historian Harumi Nishizawa collected color slides and black and white photographs taken during the dress rehearsal. However, because there are no captions for each image and no footage of the performance was recorded, it remains unknown how the play unfolded from scene to scene. In this study, I aim to reconstruct Takechi's play by arranging the photographs in chronological order and examine Schoenberg's music from the perspective of Takechi's drama making. What inspired Takechi to dramatize Pierrot lunaire? Takechi stated that he found a similarity between the Sprechstimme and Gidayu Bushi, a traditional Japanese narrative music. Here, a Tayu, narrator, recites the story with a shamisen player, including lines from all characters, regardless of gender or age. It is usually performed as part of bunraku, puppet theater, but can also be performed independently. The libret, as shown in the bottom left, The libret, as shown in the bottom left, consists of words only with red marks, including melody, dynamics, etc. The storytelling technique of Gidayu Bushi is divided into 4 categories. Dialogue is spoken without shamisen. Description of scenes and situations is sung with shamisen. There are 2 other varieties of speaking and singing: speaking musically and singing as if speaking. According to Takechi, these 2 types are similar to Sprechstimme. Let's listen to an excerpt from Woman's Gidayu, which starts with speaking and gradually moves into Sprechstimme-like section.
おつぼねたちがひっとらえ、有無を言わせず、ご心所へぐっと押し込み、上から布団のかぶせかけ、かぶせかけ。
In Takechi's production, Sprechstimme is assigned to Columbine. As a storyteller, Columbine wears the half masks that do not cover her mouth. As shown in the designer's sketch, she wears a bodysuit over which she puts her outfit, allowing for quick costume change on stage. Columbine also played the other female characters together with 2 other Nogaku actors. Nogaku is Japanese traditional performing art that combines music, dance, and drama. Although modern Nogaku theaters are indoors, they have roofs and pillars because they inherited the style of Nogaku stage from the time when it was performed outdoors. The bridge connects backstage to the main stage and represents a path linking the real world and the spiritual world. Let's look at the opening of Tsunemasa, in which a monk enters the stage through the bridge. Note the basic walking technique known as hakobi, in which he slides his feet to the accompaniment of a no-kan, no flute. There is a genre of Nogaku called Mugen-no. In this genre, a ghost or a spirit appears in the dreams of a supporting character. For example, in the first part of Taker, a woman who lives in a village and a traveling monk appear. The monk learns that the woman is the ghost of an imperial princess. In the second part, the ghost appears from her grave and reminisces about her past. As you can see in the photographs, the woman and the ghost are played by the same person, just wearing different costumes. Just like the main character in Mugen-no, Harley Quinn plays multiple roles in Takechi's production. In part 1, Harley Quinn is the seducer of Columbine. In part 2, Harley Quinn acted as the king of hell, Hellenkönig, in Pierre's dream or subconscious mind. In part 3, Harley Quinn becomes a ridiculed character like Cassandra. His costume and mask change for each role. How Takechi adapted the 21 melodramas into a play? This table summarizes slides and photographs we have today. Due to limitation in the capabilities of camera in the 1950s, all but the color slides are black and white. To give you a rough idea of the choreography, I will show you some pictures with the music. I will focus on photographs by Shozo Kitadai, the images of which are clear, probably because they were taken under bright lighting during the rehearsal. I chose the musical phrases without the Sprechstimme because there are no documents indicating how exactly the music accompanied the drama, and there are no recording of Pierrot with a Japanese translation. In Montestrunken, Pierrot wearing a costume made of transparent fabric appears with a spotlight on him as if illuminated by moonlight. Pierrot must have moved with slow and minimal motion because the actor recalled that Takechi asked him to perform like a statue. In the fourth piece, Harley Quinn enters. He wins Columbine's affections in the next scene, but soon leaves her. Pierrot is heartbroken. In part 2 depicts Pierrot's dark side in his subconscious mind. He searched for rubies in the underground. Harley Quinn let Pierrot kill Columbine, but at the end of this part, her red bloods revive Pierrot's poetic spirit. Here is the last scene from Die Kreuze. Part 3 is a nostalgia which illustrates Pierrot's desire for returning to his mother's womb. In Serenade, Pierrot turns Harley Quinn upside down and pretends to play him as if he were a cello. Altogether, Takeichi's story shows a three-act structure: introduction, confrontation that leads to a climax or a midpoint, and resolution. This structure roughly corresponds to the 5 stages of Freytag's pyramid, a description of dramatic structure proposed by 19th century novelist Gustav Freytag. Now, let's see Schoenberg's music from the perspective of Takeichi's drama making. Takeichi argued that Schoenberg must have composed the 21 pieces as one cohesive work because the score clearly shows how the pieces are connected, such as the length of the pause. In fact, on one page of the draft of Pierrot Lunaire, Schoenberg provided a list of 21 pieces with the instrumentation of each piece and its connection to adjacent piece. He wrote the total number of instruments used in each piece, and in parentheses, the number of instruments used in the transition to the next piece. In the 7th piece, the Sick Moon, the Sprechstimme is accompanied by only one instrument, by a flute. In Nogak plays, when the characters enter the stage through the bridge, the sound of no can, no flute is usually used as accompaniment. This is also called the flute that calls the gods. The bridge is the passage that connects this world with the realm of the gods. In Pierrot Lunaire, the music of the 7th piece returns as the interlude between the 30th and 14th pieces arranged for 4 instruments. This section must be the most important interlude in the work because Schoenberg wrote Überleitung in red ink, and this is the only time he wrote was in red ink in the list. To Takeichi, the 7th piece likely sounded like Pierrot entering his subconscious world, while the transition between the 13th and 14th pieces sounded like Pierrot awakening from the dream. If we disregard the numbers in parentheses, we see that the largest number 5 appears for the first time in the 11th piece, Red Math, which is the middle point of the work. The 11th piece counting from the first and last pieces. This is a turning point in Takeichi's play where Harley Quinn let Pierrot kill Columbine. In the opening of Mondestranken in the draft, Schoenberg added numbers 16 and 9 before the title. They indicated that this is the 16th poem in Halpeven's translation of Giraud's poems and the 9th song in Albertine Thames concert program. In a letter of March 12, 1912, Thames sent Schoenberg a program of Hank concert from the previous year, which consisted of 22 pieces from Otto Frieslander's Pierrot lunaire. In addition to these 22 poems, she suggested using the poems such as Columbine for composition. They are mainly lyrical poems or poems about women. Thames also asked Schoenberg not to use the poems such as parody, as she found their content unpleasant. They are sarcastic, grotesque poems or poems about Harley Quinn. This table shows what kind of poems Schoenberg chose to include. The numbers in the leftmost column indicate the order in Thames' concert program. Yes means that the poem was suggested by Thames, and no means that it was a poem that she asked Schoenberg not to use. Poems that do not belong to either category are shown as blank and shaded in blue. The three columns to the right of the title indicate the characters in the poems. They are divided into Pierrot, non-Pierrot males, and females. Here we notice a cohesion among the 7 poems in each part. Poems in part 1 are mostly about women and characterized by color white and moonlight. These poems must have reflected Thames' taste since they were recited at her concert or recommended for use by her. The next 7 poems in part 2 portray Pierrot's dark side. They depict dark night, blood, and death. Schoenberg used the poem Shift for the 10th piece to emphasize Pierrot's dark side. The 7 poems of part 3 express nostalgia, grotesque, and cruelty. It is interesting to note that the 3 nostalgic poems were either selected or suggested by Thames, but the remaining 4 are either chosen by Schoenberg or at Thames' request that they are not to be used, suggesting that the content of part 3 deviates from Thames' request and reflects Schoenberg's own intentions. This also suggests that Schoenberg must have faced difficulties in constructing part 3 if he had followed Thames' instructions. In Schoenberg's draft of Pierrot lunaire, the order of the 21 piece is different from that of the final version, as shown in the table of contents. The pieces are not necessarily in chronological order. For example, O Alta Duft is between Die Kreutze and Der Montfleck, even though it was composed last. Schoenberg placed nostalgic poems at either end of part 3 and a mirror canon at the midpoint, creating a pyramid in which music flows in the opposite direction, with the midpoint being the center of symmetry. Part 3 ends with O Alta Duft, which concludes on triads, a completely different harmony from the rest of the atonal texture. Taken together, the above examples suggest that the fundamental elements of drama were originally present in Schoenberg's music by carefully ordering the poems based on the content and the compositional techniques used within a piece. Although Takechi's play has not been revived, when Japanese directors adapt Pierrot lunaire for the stage, they often collaborate with no-gaku performers. This is probably because they find the similarity between the abstract nature of Schoenberg's music and that of no-gaku. let's listen to an excerpt from Pierrot Lunaire Mugen no Style, produced and sung by Akiko Nakajima. Here she added some passages played by Japanese traditional instruments.
Getroffen alten Ruhmes, schlungen in den Todesfreien, drunten in den Grab. Schwerter, prunkend in des Blutes Scharlat.
As shown in the above discussion, Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire continued to inspire people not only in the West, but also in the East, even 100 years after it was composed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, that was really amazing, and I think you illuminated all sorts of aspects of the piece, both the Schoenberg original and the performance in it. I think the reconstruction looks like that must have been an amazing performance, the one that you can't, that we don't, all you've managed to find. So my question is, when you played a little excerpt of the No Theater, there was the sound of the footsteps going across the floor as like a very, part of the meaning of the piece. And it seems like the sounds, like these, timbres and noises and sounds are really important in that style. And I actually think really important in Pierrot in like different ways, like the role of sound and timbre is different than a lot of pieces. But could you say something about, if you imagine the performance that we only have the photograph for, would you have expected that there would have been these, physical sounds of feet and other kinds of like non-typical musical sounds? Does that make sense as a question?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, because in Takechi uses no actors. It means they must act like no players. And the sliding motion you mentioned, I included this example because it's very basic, the most fundamental movement of no. And by walking like this, Takechi said he wanted to separate it from the real world to the subconscious or spiritual world. And no actor, and said that he wanted no actor to like a statue. It means it must be very slow and minimal motion. And you are talking about the sound? Yes. Yeah. But it's difficult to tell because no recording of the music, but it should be included in the performance. But I cannot tell. So.
I just want to ask for a microphone Toper before. In Fusako's other article, I told Fusako I read her other article. I reread it, and there was a sentence I thought that was really very interesting, or a paragraph that we always definitely the theory community, but the historians do it too. Everybody does. Oh, here come the fourth chords, the dissolution of, of tonality, the emancipation of the dissonance. And then Hashimoto, an esthetician in Japan, said, well, we've had that for 1,000 years in Japan. That the fourth sounds, and they do exist in Pierrot too, you know, they're there, and as Westerners, yes, we think they liberate, but I'm going to ask Fusako to explain that, you know, like how you, if, say, not you personally, but somebody grew up hearing a lot of Japanese music and less Western, or I don't know, maybe they'd hear pop Western, and I'm not going to speak to that. So anyway, can you tell us how that became unresolved? I mean, it didn't require resolution, the fourth chord and its history. Okay, let me make it simple. Talk about what Hashimoto said about the fourth chord and how in Japan people don't necessarily consider that sound very dissonant or requiring emotion or a resolution. It's a different kind of hearing.
I don't know I'm answer you or not, but in Japanese, the one recent music theorist used to say that in Japanese melody based on fourth, like up second and go to third, and such kind of motion is everywhere in the music. So it's not a chord, but they are very accustomed to fourth, interval fourth, and maybe people don't feel like a resolution or a conflict or resolution. It's so common in Japanese music.
So it's centered in Japanese music, so it really sounds almost, I'm not saying like a tonic, I'm not trying to say, because it wouldn't, but in function maybe.
Yes, yes.
I see. So people listening are going to be having a different impression. Shall we, any other questions for Fusako? Okay, then let's thank her. Okay, I will thank Philip Stoecker once more for our wonderful time we're having. And oh, here we are. All right, and so I think, Phil, I'm just going to read your bio, okay? Okay, Philip Stoecker is professor of music at Hofstra University. His research interests include the music of Thomas Adis, Alban Berg, George Pearl, and Arnold Schoenberg. Thomas Adis Studies, a book co-edited by Philip and Edward Venn, was awarded the 2022 Outstanding Multi-Author Collection Award from the Society for Music Theory. The National Endowment for the Humanities recently awarded Philip a summer stipend to support his revised edition of Schoenberg's Fundamentals of Musical Composition. He served as secretary of the Society for Music Theory and is currently co-chair of the Autographs and Archival Documents Interest Group. The title of his talk today is, quote, "The Unpublished Analyses of Schoenberg's Works in His Fundamentals of Musical Composition." Please welcome him.
Thank you very much. Arnold Schoenberg's Fundamentals of Musical Composition, one of his most widely read texts, codifies his thoughts on form in tonal music. The published edition of Fundamentals is based on a 200-page version left unfinished by Schoenberg in 1950. Following Schoenberg's death in 1951, two of Schoenberg's students, Gerald Strang and Leonard Stein, completed and published Fundamentals with Faber and Faber in 1967. In the late 1930s, Schoenberg had written an expanded version of fundamentals that included a wide range of thought-provoking topics and compositional ideas not found in the published edition. For instance, in Draft 2 from 1939, Schoenberg discusses dance forms and two-part song form, both of which survive only in draft versions and never made it into the published version of fundamentals. In addition to the nearly 300 examples published in the book, there are approximately 130 additional musical examples that were likely being considered for inclusion in fundamentals, but were eventually edited out of the published book. Some of these withdrawn examples, shown here, were composed by Schoenberg to demonstrate a particular compositional technique or form, and some of the examples were Schoenberg's own analyses of excerpts from the musical literature. While the music of Bach, Brahms, Mozart, and especially Beethoven make up most of the examples in fundamentals, Schoenberg's own music is minimally represented. In the published version of the book, only 3 of Schoenberg's works are cited: Traumleben, the first of the 8 songs, Opus 6, the 4th movement of String Quartet No. 2, and the 1st movement of String Quartet No. 1. Having carefully examined all the drafts of fundamentals, I have determined that in addition to these 3 examples, there are 4 additional excerpts composed by Schoenberg that appear in the typescript and/or the handwritten musical examples. These unpublished analyses of Schoenberg's works include Pelleas und Melisande, Verklärte Nacht, Lieder, and a passage from the 1st movement of String Quartet No. 2. Schoenberg's 4th String Quartet is another analyzed excerpt that is among the draft materials, but I believe this analysis was most likely intended for another project and not fundamentals. And so what I've done on this slide is anything that appears in fundamentals, I've highlighted in blue for you. For my talk today, I will focus on 4 analyses of Schoenberg's works. I will first discuss 3 of his compositions that were intended for Chapter 14, and then turn my attention to the 4th String Quartet. Chapter 14, titled Uneven, Irregular, and Asymmetrical Construction, is devoted to sentence and period phrase structures that display unequal or asymmetrical proportions. Schoenberg discusses the music of Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, and Brahms, and includes an excerpt from Bartók's 3rd String Quartet. The second draft of Fundamentals, which dates from 1939, is an important source for this chapter since it contains unpublished analyses of Schoenberg's early works, so Verklärte Nacht, Lieder, and the 1st String Quartet. So let's take a look at these Draft 2 analyses. Example 170A, shown here, is Schoenberg's analysis of a 7-measure passage from his Verklärte Nacht. The example is handwritten with black ink and is annotated with brackets below the score. And this is what Schoenberg writes in Draft 2. Among my own works, there are a number of themes whose construction is based on phrases of uneven length. In example 170A, the 1st and 2nd phrases are 1 measure. The 3rd is 3 measures and uses A as a connective. The 4th is 2/3 of a measure and is repeated as the 5th phrase with an extension. So let's listen to this passage and take note of the uneven phrase lengths. Schoenberg then provides an analysis of his aria, Now I Tell You for the First Time, from the first part of Gurrelieder. Schoenberg explains here how his aria consists of uneven phrase lengths. So he writes, example 170b consists of 5 sections of 5 measures each, but they differ partly in their composition. The first and second are 3 plus 2. The third is 2 plus 3. The fourth is 1 plus 2 plus 2. The fifth is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 2. So again, this is a passage that features uneven phrase lengths, so 5 measures each. Schoenberg then discusses the opening theme from his first string quartet. Before I examine this draft 2 analysis, I will return to the published version of this passage that appears in Fundamentals and discuss the paragraph from chapter 14 of the published book that mentions Schoenberg's first quartet. So this is taken directly out of Fundamentals. Irregular construction becomes more frequent in the second half of the 19th century. Brahms and Mahler, under the influence of folk music, developed a feeling that often led to a free rhythmic organization, which does not correspond to the bar lines. Examples 111, A and B. And so notice Schoenberg is not mentioned here. It may seem to readers that example 111 will consist of 2 excerpts, one by Brahms and one by Mahler. Example 111a does in fact consist of a passage by Brahms, his string quartet opus 51, number 2. Example 111b, however, is not Mahler, but the opening theme from Schoenberg's first string quartet. Although Schoenberg's string quartet is not explicitly mentioned in this paragraph, and readers are not given much information in the text explaining these 2 excerpts, both examples include brackets above and below the music to demonstrate how their construction does not correspond to the bar lines. Returning now to draft 2, the typescript explains the meaning of the brackets that appear in Fundamentals and offers 2 different ways to interpret the structure of this opening theme. So Schoenberg writes, example 170c could be analyzed either in correspondence to the natural phrasing as beginning with a 3-measure unit or as beginning with a 2.5-measure unit as the construction indicates. In both cases, the second phrase will be 2.5 measures. This seems interesting because it shows, as can be observed in many themes of the masters, that the phrasing can differ from the construction. Some of the braces that were notated here on the draft 2 example are replicated in fundamentals, and these specific markings correspond to what Schoenberg called the construction of the theme. So I've highlighted here for you his interpretation according to the construction. So you see the braces that's below, and each phrase begins with 3 beats. So the first phrase, according to the construction, 3 beats in the first phrase, the second 3 beats, and the third also 3 beats. And those braces are replicated in fundamentals as the lower set of brackets. Another interpretation according to the construction is each phrase beginning with a dotted 8th followed by a 16th. So this first phrase, dotted 8th, 16th, right here. Then the next phrase, dotted 8th, 16th, and the next phrase. This analysis is also replicated in fundamentals, and that is the higher set of brackets. Now, Schoenberg mentions the natural phrasing of this theme. And so he's put a brace above the music to show that the natural phrasing begins with 3 measures. This analysis is not replicated in fundamentals. So we don't see any brackets to show the natural phrasing of this opening theme. So let's listen. And again, notice the uneven phrase links. Schoenberg's draft 2 analyses of the uneven phrase lengths in his Verklärte Nacht and Chorlieder were unfortunately removed from all subsequent drafts. And the typescript explaining the natural phrasing and construction of the opening theme from his first string quartet was also not included in fundamentals. The only evidence of these draft 2 analyses in the published version of fundamentals is the annotated musical example of Schoenberg's first string quartet. The final analysis that I will share with you today concerns Schoenberg's string quartet number 4, opus 37. This 12-tone work was composed in 1936, just a year before Schoenberg and Strang began working together on fundamentals. Schoenberg's analysis of measures 1 to 8 from the first movement of his quartet is among the draft materials for fundamentals. The analysis is notated on a single sheet of staff paper, is handwritten with pencil, and includes brackets, carets, and braces to highlight the motivic, rhythmic, and formal structures of the passage. There is no typewritten text explaining this analysis, but at the top of the page, Schoenberg includes a description of his annotations. These explanations are handwritten with blue pencil and a black pen. I will only focus on Schoenberg's analysis of the phrase structure of his opening theme. But first, I will play this passage for you. And I just want to point out he made a couple notational errors. In measures 4 to 5, the last notes should be F sharp and B natural. And then in measure 6, this pickup motive should be C, A flat, G, and he notated it as G, A flat, C sharp. As Schoenberg explains at the top of the page, phrases are indicated with braces. According to Schoenberg's analysis, the first phrase is 1.5 measures long, the second phrase is 1 measure in length, and the last phrase is nearly 3 measures long if we include the sustained B natural in measures 5 to 6. So I want to play each of these phrases for you. The first one is 1.5 measures, so this is according to Schoenberg. Next phrase, 1 measure. And the last phrase, 3 measures. For me, Schoenberg's analysis of the phrase structure of his 4th string quartet bears a resemblance to both his discussion of uneven phrase lengths in Chapter 14 of Fundamentals and the Draft 2 analyses that I just discussed. Returning to Chapter 14 on uneven, irregular, and asymmetrical construction, Schoenberg points out near the beginning of the chapter that sentence phrase structures are more frequently composed of elements of differing lengths than periods. As an example, Schoenberg cites the overture to The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart. Schoenberg remarks that the construction of Mozart's sentence is, quote, made up of 5 units totaling 7 measures, 1 plus 2, then 1, 1, 2. For Schoenberg, a typical sentence is 8 measures long and consists of a 2-measure basic idea that is immediately repeated, followed by a continuation for 4 measures. The Marriage of Figaro sentence, however, begins with a 1-measure basic idea that is followed by a 2-measure basic idea. Because of the different lengths of these 2 basic ideas, Mozart's sentence is 7 measures, not 8. Before I return to Schoenberg's 4th string quartet, I wish to revisit his analysis of his Gurrelieder. As Schoenberg wrote in the 2nd draft of Fundamentals, his aria consists of 5 phrases of 5 measures each. Schoenberg provided an earlier analysis of the same aria that resonates with his Draft 2 analysis. In a 1931 discussion that was broadcast on Radio Berlin, Schoenberg talks about the construction of his aria from Gurrelieder. And notice that Schoenberg mentions the music of Mozart. And even the piece from Gurrelieder, Now I Tell You for the First Time, quite unconsciously, here I wrote 5 5-measure phrases in a row. And you should not judge my earlier work by the elements that I did not develop further, but rather by the elements that give my style its direction, not by the Tristan sound that is reminiscent of Wagner, but rather by the freedom of phrase lengths that is reminiscent of Mozart, because that is what becomes very characteristic for me. In a 1949 interview at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Schoenberg once again mentions the influence of Mozart on his compositional writing.
I think that there is a possibility to learn something of my technical achievements. But I think it is even better to go back to those men from whom I learned them. I mean, to Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, and Bach. I can really contend that I owe very, very much to Mozart. And if one studies, for instance, the way in which I write for string quartet, then one cannot deny that I have learned this directly from Mozart. And I am proud of it.
Returning to Schoenberg's 4th string quartet, I suggest that his analysis, was possibly intended to show how the opening theme could be analyzed and heard as a 6-measure sentence, that is, composed of elements of differing lengths. So something that Mozart would do, and then Schoenberg would be inspired by that. Before I play a recording of this opening passage one final time, I will play my recomposed version of the opening theme, in which the second phrase is 1.5 measures. This not only duplicates the length of the first basic idea, but it also creates a regular sentence structure. So here's my recomposed version. And now the Juilliard String Quartet. The braces, brackets, and carets that were notated on this unpublished analysis of Schoenberg's 4th string quartet can be found on many of the musical examples throughout fundamentals. I believe, however, that this analysis was not intended to be included in the book. All the analyses of Schoenberg's works among the draft materials for fundamentals pertain to his early works. There is no mention or discussion of composing with 12 tones in fundamentals, nor in the drafts. The audience for this analysis is a mystery. Perhaps Schoenberg was planning to write program notes for a performance of this quartet, since this analysis is labeled as Example 1, and you see that in the top left-hand corner. The 4 analyses that I shared with you today exist only as draft versions, and as far as I know, these specific analyses are not replicated elsewhere in Schoenberg's output. And all the unpublished analyses that never made it into fundamentals provide informative and illuminating interpretations that Schoenberg made about his own compositions. These analytic drafts reveal how Schoenberg's music is a natural evolution of the music of Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, and Bach, the Austro-German composers that he so revered throughout his life. Thank you, and I welcome your comments and suggestions.
Anybody? Questions, folks? I'm going to go back to, I'm going to ask you 2 questions.
Yeah.
Mine is first a comment, and I want
Yeah.
your opinion on it. Go back to the Opus 37. No, yes, stop.
You have the microphone.
Oh, yeah. You don't. Nobody wants to answer. I assume you haven't. No questions, so I'll blab on. I just wanted to ask Phil. I'm going to ask him 2 things. One on this and something else. In measures 4, 5, and 6, there's the bottom part. Da 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 da. That ending, that da da, is very much like the beginning. Now, if you can, Schoenberg's always marking the upper parts, but though he does mark the bottom part with D and the rhythmic idea. If you considered that going in the bass, and then you follow it through the da-da-dum, da-dum. I always thought he was going to start the tune again in 5 and 6 when I heard da-dum at the very end. And can you tell me, why he didn't do the interactive thing? And if you think that, what can I say? Let's see, that the opening, it ends it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That he's coming back to something that was more stable. Do you have any comments on this? I'm not looking for anything in particular. I'm just pointing.
Sure. I want to go back to the slide where we can actually see the entire page.
Okay.
Now, anything that is labeled with sort of a caret, right, is a rhythmic analysis. And you see there in the bass clef, there is a D, right, and a caret. And so below that, let me just do the bigger view for you. I wanted to have an up-close version. You can see at the very bottom of the page, he writes a letter followed by dots. For example, D ... means liquidation. So he is viewing measures 4, 5, and 6, the accompanying parts, as a liquidation of the opening rhythmic motive. Now that goes very much hand in hand with the sentence structure, right? You have the basic idea, then you repeat it so you can memorize it, right? And then the phrase breaks down, right, into its bare minimum, and then you reach your cadence. And when I saw that with the liquidation, it sounds so much like a sentence to me.
So it goes back to the essential element.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Other?
Yeah.
Oh.
So this is also about Opus 37's opening.
Yeah.
There's a couple of us who have done metrical analyses of
Yeah.
this. I mean, Richard Kurth has one
Yeah.
where he does the first violin line, and then I went ahead and added a in the 12-tone book of the other instruments. And so I'm wondering, well, it's really two questions. Does Schoenberg do like a herd meter analysis of this, and how would that line up with the phrasing as he's indicated it? And then hard to remember Kurth's analysis, but I think it starts in 4/4 and then it goes to 6/4 or something like that. Also, David Lewin. I think he was basing his work on something that Lewin did with this piece. I wonder, how the phrasing relates to those analyses. Does it line up or not line up? Or
That's a great question. And do you think his rhythmic analysis lines up with your thoughts on it?
I'd have to go back and look, honestly. My sense is the first violin line does not line up with what Lewin and Kurth said about the herd meter.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I mean,
I was playing around with the idea of playing all the parts. And when I was recomposing that melody, I really ran into some difficulties here because it's so consistent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4. And then when I made that second phrase 1.5 measures, then I was sort of stumped as to where I should put 2, 3, 4, right? And so, I had a lot of difficulty sort of recomposing that, and so I said, well, let me just stick to the melody instead. So, yeah.
The two parts of the texture offset each other, and I think
right.
that's
right.
and they offset the phrasing, I think, too, probably.
Yeah. And I don't know if you can see it in measure 7, letter D, and there's an arrow here. And he says, a letter with an arrow means it's varied, right? So at the beginning, very clear, 2, 3, 4, so on. And then you have your 3 beats again, but it's varied by da, 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 da. And so I find his rhythmic analyses extremely interesting and really changed the way I heard this passage. And I'll be honest, I know this piece. I've had my students sing this piece in ear training, and I never really thought of it as a sentence structure until I saw this. And then it was, of course, it's a sentence structure, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, I think you talked about this at the start, and maybe it's self-evident to everybody, but could you just remind me or say again So how did you get from how did we get from the 1939 draft to then what Strang and Stein did, and what were the motivating forces for the leaving things out and changing things? And maybe you said that already, and if you did, I'm sorry.
As it pertains to the string
like what was
quartet?
left out and why, and
Okay,
and
so this analysis is in a folder that is among the draft materials for fundamentals. I really don't think it belongs in fundamentals. I don't think it was ever meant to be in fundamentals. But I do find his analysis as an evolution, really, of the music of Mozart. So in some ways, it really is appropriate that's among the draft materials for fundamentals, because he talks about Beethoven and Mozart so much. But it's not among the draft materials, so it's not part of draft 2 or draft 3. It's just a sheet of paper that's among the materials.
Phil and I discussed this about what historically, and I said that the Coach Quartet was going to play the fourth, they were going to premiere it. And I thought maybe that he did some of this for them, because the dates squared away, I think, because they were going to play the quartet a couple of weeks later or a month later or something. So it's possible that was it, but there's no proof of it.
Yeah.
Just hypothesis.
So, great presentation. Do you have any theories about what happened in terms of politics, of inclusion or exclusion between Strang and Stein? Or did the publisher say, hey, it cannot be more than so and so many pages? Or what do you think what happened?
That's a great question. All right. So there are 6 drafts for fundamentals. The 4th draft dates from, Severine and I talked about this, we'll say 48 to 50. And that was the last draft that Schoenberg was working on. When you compare draft 4 to fundamentals, it's quite similar, but there's a lot more analyses, so some things were taken out, right? Draft 5, only Strang did that. And when you compare draft 5 with fundamentals, it's almost a carbon copy, almost exactly. So I think at some point Strang might have had some pressure from Faber and Faber to reduce the number of words, right? As happens to many of us. And also, so it was going, it was published in 1967, and in 1967, Gertrude was quite sick, and she died in 1967. So I think maybe Strang and Stein tried to speed things up a little bit, and some things just kind of fell to the side. Okay, Strang did draft 5, almost a carbon copy. When you look at draft 6, Stein did draft 6. He made no changes to draft 5, none whatsoever. There's a few handwritten remarks, but it's exactly the same. So he really didn't do anything different. He took draft 5, maybe changed a word here or there, and off it went to Faber and Faber.
This is about a 10-year-old memory at this point, so I could be completely wrong, but I think it's in the Strang papers. Yeah. There is some analysis of the 3rd string quartet, and I think that Schoenberg was using Strang to prepare some kind of talk about the 3rd string quartet in 35 or 36. Yeah. And so I would go back and look and see if you can find those and compare with what you see here.
That'd be great.
Because I think they might be related.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's possible that's that one page is part of that, and somehow it ended up in.
It's possible because my memory, and gosh, let me tell you, this is 10 years old, is that there's it kind of like starts, in Schoenberg's hand and then goes into Strang's hand. So it's like Schoenberg was kind of teaching him a little bit about the third quartet, and then he was, gonna.
Great. Okay.
So check that out.
I will.
But this is fantastic.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Thanks. Great. Thank you. All right. Thank you.